Alright, so on today's episode, we are returning this old barn find into a machete. You can see the logo there from Crate Club, but I'll get to that later. So what we got to do is we got to remove this wood handle on this old hay knife or whatever this thing was. So I got out the angle grinder and I was cutting out the rivets. And they're actually surprisingly quite difficult to get off. Whoever made this thing was, well enough, they knew what they were doing. But not only did I need to cut them out of the wood, but I also needed to pry the wood handle off. So I don't know if they used some type of solvent or if this was just years of abuse and grease and crap that was stuck in this thing. But eventually I managed to get this thing off. So once I got the handle off, then it was down to the design. Now, I was going with this kukri type psychotic blade that I was trying to go with, but I ended up going with just a random design that I winged it. So at this stage, I need to start shaping the blade and start figuring out exactly how large the arch is going to be. So once I started carving the curve into the blade with the grinder, I noticed that the metal actually got quite thick. So at the tip of the arch, the metal was quite thick, so it needs to be tapered quite a bit. So that's going to absorb some of the cutting and shaping into the blade. The edge of the blade I cut down into like this reverse tanto style so that it came to a really sharp point at the end of it rather than at the top. I thought of, just for the sake of doing it, to keep the blade length as long as I could, so the cutting area, but also keep that aggressive shape. Now that we've got that done, I'm going to carve or not carve, but drill the holes into the spine of the knife to keep the weight down, but also in hopes to keep it from getting stuck. Now at this point, the holes are drilled, and I got to clean up the back of the knife. The reason for that was because whoever had this before must have been hitting the back of the knife with a hammer or rock of some kind, because the whole back of it was dimpled with abuse. So once I've cleaned that up, then it came down to cleaning up the blade. I went from a rough, wet, dry 60 grit to a 80 grit in hopes to try and clean up all the crap and crud that was stuck in all these dimples. You can see some of the dents and dimples that are still got that dirt stuck in it, so I used a solvent and some light grit sandpaper to clean it up afterwards. My plan with this scrap of angle iron is to extend the tang of the knife so that the center of gravity shifts further back and it becomes lighter to swing and wield. What I ended up having to do in order to do this, rather than just clamping it together, I had to use the angle grinder and the cutoff wheel to cut right down the middle of the angle iron. I measured it and it just so happened to fit right in the middle. It was really hot this day, but you can see on the other side of my hand that I had little room to go. This piece of metal got so hot I couldn't even touch it with my gloves. It was melting through my gloves into my hand. So I had to let it sit for quite a while. But then once it did, I clamped it shut and then started shaping the handle so that I had as minimal overlap as possible to keep the weight down on the handle as well, because the handle is going to be wood. At this point, I used the 5-minute metal epoxy. and I used a couple of bolts and screws that I'm going to be using to actually keep the handle onto the blade as well. Now I went with hardware store build. I wasn't going for anything fancy, ultimately because I couldn't find the rivets to keep a handle onto a knife. I let the epoxy cure for about a day, and once it was cured, I took the clamps off, and then I started coating the blade with Flex Seal. From Rust-Oleum, it's referred to as, I forget what the name of it was. It's even in the damn video, but basically it's just a rubberized spray paint compound, and it stood up to abuse. The handle, I'm actually using old stumpage from when I was felling trees in my yard. And what I did was I let them dry and cure out, and then started sanding them down and shaping them to try and keep an antique vibe going on this thing. I wanted a lot of character and depth of color when it came to shaping this handle. I had to condense over 8 hours of footage for this 13-minute video, but it definitely was worth it. It was my first project designing a knife, fabbing one, to even shaping a handle, to weight and balance and stuff like that. I ended up using a hole saw and insetting a hole above the bolt so that the actual head of the bolt would sit into the wood slightly, and the same as the nut as well. Once this happened, and I actually deemed it as secure, I started burning the wood with a small butane lighter. I tried staining the wood, but the wood stain just didn't give me the desired effect that I was going for. So I used a butane lighter to burn the character into the wood, and then I ended up using a very fine or super fine grit to try and sand off some of the imperfections. I went with this particular 3M wet dry P400. I wanted to focus on that because the P400 wet dry has been my go-to sandpaper for just about everything. This stuff stands up to quite a bit. So if you catch edges and stuff like that, it actually doesn't wear down that well, and 3M does a quality product. It's no sponsorship of any kind, it's just a shameless plug because they make a quality product. This is dollar store epoxy I'm using to put into where the nuts are on the bolt, in hopes that they never come loose. Once I epoxied all the open area, I started painting the handle of the knife almost as if it was a regular resin that somebody would use for a decorative piece. In doing so, I was hoping that not only would it seal the wood, but it would also protect it from any sort of moisture or condensation or anything like that from being out in the field. I got quite a bit of gloss on it, but I ended up bringing it down to the sanding wheel and taking some of that gloss off. I also brought down the heads of the bolts with a belt sander so that they were flat, or flush. And this is the end product. So I went from this, which was this random hay knife crap thing from an antique shop, to a pretty sweet looking machete for my first build.
There's no demonstration as to the capability of it or the durability of the handle, so we're going to do that now. Alright, so that didn't go as planned. The blades and handle held up just fine. I was expecting some breakage, but given the fact that I sealed the bolts with epoxy, that's him, he's sharing his 2 cents. given the fact that I sealed it with epoxy, nothing was going anywhere. And that metal epoxy that I had, the 5-minute metal epoxy to seal the handle and the rest of the blade, that held up. So ultimate takeaways, it wasn't really sharp enough to get through saplings, but the saplings were about, you know, that thick at least. I wasn't expecting to go through it like butter, but the older branches were clean through. So is it a good blade? Needs some sharpening, yes. Handle definitely needs some fine tuning. I'm sure you can see through the video that the handle is still quite thick. So if I choose to ever fix it, I would definitely make a thinner handle. So if you plan on undertaking a project like this, I would go with a thinner handle than you probably think. I went for like a nice handle that would fit in your hand. But when you're really tomahawking it, it has a tendency of slipping. So my opinion towards that, or my advice towards you, would be to dovetail or bevel the handle out when you're shaping it, so that the hand doesn't have a tendency of slipping forwards or backwards. And that's it. Thanks for watching Pro Gear Reviews. Make sure you like, subscribe, hit that bell button, because I got a lot more coming. I got nothing but time.